Okay, so we're taking a deep dive into the world of plastering. It's about smooth walls. Everyone knows that much, at least. But what's the real deal with this line of work? What does it really take to be a great plasterer? That's what we're here to find out. Digging into this stack of info you gave us, we've even got some stuff from RoleCatcher, which is cool. Prepare to be surprised.
It's funny how often people dismiss trades like plastering, like, oh, it's just spreading stuff around. But there's actually a ton you need to know, a lot of skill involved. People don't get that.
Seriously, even I was like, whoa, when I read this line in Rollcatcher's Guide, transforming ordinary walls into works of art. Works of art, really. That's what they're calling it these days.
It's a bold statement for sure. I mean, most people just paint over that stuff anyway. But it does make you think maybe there's more to this job than meets the eye. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. The guide actually breaks down what a typical day looks like for a plasterer. And let me tell you, it's not exactly a walk in the park.
Okay, so paint me a picture, so to speak. What are we talking about here?
Imagine this. You're hauling heavy bags of gypsum. That's the main ingredient in plaster, by the way, up ladders, mixing it to just the right consistency, and then applying it perfectly.
Okay, heavy lifting, I can imagine that. But you said applying it perfectly. There's more to it than just slapping it on there.
Oh yeah, way more to it. The guide actually uses the term flawless finish, and they're not kidding. You're talking about creating a completely smooth surface, and often on a huge scale. It has to be level, no imperfections. You mess that up and your wall's gonna look like a wave pool.
Rookie mistake alert. So the guide mentioned mixing the plaster. Is that where people usually mess up when they're just starting out? What happens if you don't mix it right?
Oh, you'll know it. If it's too runny, it won't stick how it's supposed to. That means cracks, uneven surfaces, the whole 9 yards. And if it's too thick, then it's a pain to work with, creates more work for you in the long run. It's all about finding that sweet spot, takes a good eye and a lot of practice. Actually, I remember when I was just starting out, I totally misjudged the drying time once.
Uh-oh. Story time. What happened?
Let's just say it was a very valuable lesson in reading those product instructions carefully. I ended up having to redo an entire ceiling. It was not pretty.
Yikes, I bet. Sounds like attention to detail is key here. The guide also mentioned different kinds of plaster, like cement-based ones. Is that where it gets more complicated?
For sure. Every material's got its own quirks, its own best use.
Hmm.
Cement-based plaster, for example, that stuff's tough. They use it a lot for exterior work or in places where there's a lot of moisture. Knowing which plaster to use and when, that's what separates the pros from the amateurs. A good finish makes everyone happy.
Okay, so not just a plasterer, but a material scientist too. Plus a sculptor, a detective for figuring out the right approach for each job.
Huh, that's one way to put it. And don't forget about the safety stuff. The guide goes on and on about dust, chemicals, heights, all that fun stuff.
Right, right. Those strong arms aren't just for show. It's easy to forget about that side of things, though.
It's not something you want to ignore. Imagine breathing in plaster dust all day. Not exactly good for you. Proper ventilation, masks, those are non-negotiables. And then there's working way up high. Let's just say you don't want to slip.
So we're talking physical strength, a good eye, knowing your materials, and a whole lot of caution. Who knew there was so much to plastering? Honestly, this is starting to feel less like fixing up your house and more like some high-stakes art form.
Now you're getting it. And speaking of high stakes, the guide goes pretty in-depth about how you can move up in this field. It's surprisingly structured, actually.
Structured?
Yeah.
That's not something you usually hear about with trades. So how does it work?
Well, it usually starts with an apprenticeship, which is pretty common for a lot of trades.
Yeah.
You're basically learning everything on the job, right? Getting those fundamentals down, watching the more experienced plasterers, paying your dues, you could say, and probably getting covered in plaster while you're at it.
Makes sense. Okay, so you've put in the time, learned from the best, maybe had a few plaster mishaps along the way. What's next in your quest to be a plastering master?
That's when you typically move up to a junior plasterer position. Now you're getting into more complicated stuff, maybe even running some smaller projects yourself. Actually, the guide mentions a junior plasterer who specializes in Venetian plastering. Ever heard of that?
Venetian plastering, yeah, it sounds familiar. But if you asked me to point it out compared to, regular plastering, I'm not sure I could.
It's all about creating that super luxurious look, kind of like a marble finish. They use multiple layers of plaster, and it's pigmented too, really specialized skill. You mostly see it in the high-end places, fancy homes and stuff. So a junior plasterer who can do that. Talk about a valuable skill set.
Wow, I had no idea there were plastering specialties. So you start as an apprentice, then you become a junior plasterer, and maybe find a niche like that Venetian plastering. What's the end goal? Do you end up like a plastering guru or something?
Well, the guide calls it a skilled plasterer. Kind of covers it, I guess. At that point, you're not just good at the technical stuff. You're managing projects, showing the apprentices the ropes. You're basically the boss.
Huh. From covered in plaster to calling the shots. That's quite a journey. Okay, but let's back up for a second. Say you read all this and decide, yep, plastering's for me. How do you actually go about landing that first apprenticeship? Does RoleCatcher have any tips for that?
Oh, they've got you covered there, too. Their interview prep section is amazing. Really helpful stuff. And it's not generic advice or anything. They're talking specifically about plastering jobs. Like, they actually give you real interview questions they might ask you with extra tips on what the interviewers are looking for in your answer. Really useful stuff.
All right, you've got me curious. What kind of questions are we talking about here?
Well, one they emphasize is, how do you ensure your plastering work is of high quality? Sounds kind of basic, but there's actually a lot you can say to stand out from the crowd and really impress them.
Right, because anyone can say, oh, I'm a perfectionist, but that doesn't really prove anything, does it? So what are they looking for in an answer?
They want specifics. This is your time to shine, Show them, your stuff, different techniques, the materials, how to get that perfect finish. Maybe even throw in that story about the drying time mishap.
Huh, good point. Little honesty and humor never hurt. So RoleCatcher gives you the questions, but what about the answers? They don't actually write your resume for you, do they?
Well, not quite. But they do have this really cool AI tool that can analyze job descriptions and then help you tweak your resume to make sure you're highlighting the right skills. Kind of like having your own digital career coach.
Wow, okay, that's pretty impressive. AI for getting a job plastering walls. The future is now. Speaking of the future, we've talked about all the good stuff, but what about the not so fun parts of this job? The guide mentioned some safety concerns.
Right, it's not all perfect finishes and big paychecks. It can be tough on your body, especially when you're first starting out. Lifting those heavy materials, working in awkward positions, even the repetitive movements. It all adds up.
And then there's the whole safety hazard thing we were talking about earlier. The guide was pretty upfront about the risks, with the dust, the chemicals, working up high, all that.
Exactly. It's not like you're sitting at a desk all day, that's for sure. You got to be aware of your surroundings and really committed to taking those safety precautions seriously. They even talk about how important it is to stay updated on the latest safety regulations and all that.
So it's about more than just having the muscle for it. You need to work smart and stay safe.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of challenges, the guide also mentions how important it is to keep learning new things in this field. Remember those eco-friendly materials we were talking about before?
Oh, yeah, right. The future of plastering is green. What's the deal with those anyway? Do they actually work as well as the traditional stuff?
It's a good question. And a lot of people are wondering the same thing. That whole push for sustainability, it's affecting everything these days. Construction, plastering, you name it. Like clay-based plasters are getting popular, for instance. Not only are they better for the environment, but they also do some pretty cool things like regulate moisture better, help walls breathe. And then you've got plasters made from recycled materials like scraps from gypsum board.
So it's more than just a trend than these eco-friendly plasters are here to stay. But if you're already a plasterer or just starting out, how does that impact you?
Means you got to be ready to adapt.
Right.
Always open to picking up new techniques. The way they used to do things with the traditional materials, it doesn't always translate to these new materials, So a good plasterer, they need to stay informed about the new stuff, all these eco-friendly products coming out, figure out how they work, and adjust their methods accordingly.
Sounds like there's always something new to learn.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting, would you say? It's this cool blend of old school craftsmanship and cutting edge innovations.
Wow, that's amazing. You wouldn't think there'd be so much going on in such a traditional field, like plastering's having a moment. But anyway, we've talked about a lot, like the actual work, mixing the plaster and all that, and then the high-tech stuff, with AI helping people get jobs. But there's one thing I keep coming back to. That whole thing about transforming walls into works of art. Are they serious with that, or is that just some fancy writing in the guide?
Oh, they're serious.
Yeah.
Think about those Venetian plasterers we were talking about before.
Mhm.
That's art right there.
Yeah.
But even beyond that specific kind of thing, there's an art to getting that perfect finish, understanding how the light hits it, how different textures look, even picking the right plaster for the job so it all comes together. aesthetically.
So they need to have a designer's eye, too.
Yeah.
Never would have thought of a plasterer as like an interior designer's secret weapon.
It's true. A good plasterer can make all the difference in a design. They know how to get those smooth, clean surfaces for a minimalist look, or how to add some texture and depth if you want something more rustic. They could even sculpt stuff, like decorative elements, that just elevate the whole space.
Okay, I'm impressed. We've talked about the physical side of it, the skills you need, the safety stuff, and now the artistic side, too. What else is there? I feel like we've covered it all.
Well, we've only just scratched the surface, really, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for this craft. It's more complex and more interesting than people realize.
Definitely has. Who knew you could learn so much about plastering? It's not just one thing, it's everything. You need strength, attention to detail, you need to be eager to learn, and even have a little bit of that artistic flair.
Yeah, exactly. And like we were talking about, it's a field that's changing all the time with new technology, new materials. It's got a bright future, that's for sure. Maybe it's even the right career path for you.
So, if you're not afraid of some hard work, you've got a good eye for detail, and maybe you're a bit of an artist at heart. Well, plastering might just be that hidden gem of a career you've been looking for.
Now, here's something to think about. We've been talking about how AI can help you become a plasterer, even analyze job descriptions and all that. But what about AI actually doing the plastering itself? Could we get to a point where robots are doing the heavy lifting, literally? Like, picture a robotic arm applying the plaster perfectly with superhuman precision, and then you've got the human plasterer there, overseeing everything, adding those artistic touches, making sure it's all perfect. Pretty wild to think about, right?
A robot plasterer. That sounds like something out of a movie. But honestly, after everything we've learned today, I wouldn't be surprised. This deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to what's possible in the world of plastering.